Some nurses think 3 years on the floor makes them chief of medicine. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 48 minutes before Captain James Rivera was wheeled into Cedar Creek Medical with shrapnel wounds from a training accident. The fluorescent lights hum above the ICU at 2:17 a.m., antiseptic burning in the air like bleach mixed with ozone, the click of Margaret Walsh's sensible shoes on cold linoleum the only sound as she checks vitals on a post-op patient. She's 53, graying hair in a tight bun, hands that never shake when inserting fours, the kind of nurse doctors forget is in the room until something goes wrong. Her face carries the composed stillness of someone who has already seen the worst the world can offer and decided not to flinch. On her third finger she turns a tarnished challenge coin over and over, the metal worn smooth from 20 years of nervous habit, a ritual no one notices because no one looks closely enough at the aging floor nurse working the night shift in Building C. When she reaches for a chart, her sleeve rides up revealing a faded scar that wraps around her forearm like rope burn, thin white lines that tell a story she will never speak aloud. The mark is from 2003, from Ramadi, from a thing that officially never happened. She pulls the sleeve down with her left hand while her right continues writing vitals in the patient log with surgical precision, blood pressure 118/74, heart rate 62, oxygen saturation 98% on 2 liters. The numbers are steady. The numbers are always steady. A junior resident named Chen approaches the nursing station at 2:34 a.m., holding a tablet and looking harried. "We've got a new ICU admission coming up from Trauma Bay," he says, his voice carrying the sleep deprivation rasp of someone who has been awake for 31 hours straight. Captain James Rivera, Navy, stable but monitoring for delayed cardiac complications. Shrapnel from a training accident at Joint Base Lewis McChord. Margaret's hand freezes on the challenge coin for exactly 3 seconds. The metal becomes slick under her fingers. She does not look up. She does not breathe differently. She turns the coin over once more, then sets it carefully beside her pen on the desk and asks, "Age?" 32, Chen says, already scrolling through the digital chart. No active surgeries, just waiting on imaging clearance to rule out secondary injuries. Dr. Caldwell wants him under continuous cardiac monitoring until at least 0600. She nods once and begins preparing Rivera's intake paperwork with the same methodical efficiency she has applied to every admission for 3 years and 17 days. The coin sits beside her pen, catching the fluorescent light, its edges worn down from thousands of rotations across her fingers. No one knows what it means. No one knows that she has carried it since a man named Carlos Rivera pressed it into her hand in a collapsed building while his son screamed in her arms. No one knows that she promised to return it to his father and that his father never made it home. The ICU is quiet in the way that only a hospital at 2:08 a.m. can be quiet, machines beeping in steady rhythm, fluorescent lights buzzing like distant wasps, the occasional sound of rubber-soled shoes on tile from night shift staff moving between rooms. Margaret finishes preparing Rivera's bed, checking the monitor cables, confirming the crash cart is positioned within arm's reach, setting the bed rails to the optimal height for someone with shrapnel injuries. She works with the fluid grace of someone who has performed these movements 10,000 times, muscle memory embedded so deep that her hands move while her mind stays somewhere else entirely. 20 years. That is how long it has been since she held a 7-year-old child while his father died. At 6:03 a.m., Dr. Caldwell arrives at Cedar Creek Medical in pressed charcoal scrubs that cost more than Margaret makes in a week, Italian leather loafers polished to a mirror shine, his hair styled with the kind of precision that suggests a barber rather than a home mirror. He is 41 years old, recently appointed chief of surgery, with political ambitions that extend beyond the hospital walls to the state health commissioner's office, a position currently occupied by the brother-in-law of the board chairman. His appointment is not yet final. The board will vote in 23 days. Everything from now until that vote must be flawless. Everything must demonstrate that he is exactly what Cedar Creek Medical needs, a surgeon who runs operations like a Swiss watch, where every nurse knows her place and no one questions protocol. He walks through the ICU with his phone already at his ear, speaking in the clipped voice of someone used to being obeyed immediately. 3 new admissions, all routine, all within established parameters. I want the standard protocols followed to the letter. No modifications, no exceptions, no nurses thinking they know better than the surgical team. He says this last part louder, aware that the nursing staff are within earshot, aware that his words are meant not as instruction but as warning. Margaret is checking the fall line on Rivera's left arm, adjusting the drip rate, her face a mask of professional neutrality. She does not look toward Caldwell. She does not acknowledge that she has heard him. Rivera is awake, which is unusual given the pain medication in his system, his dark eyes tracking movement around the room with the heightened awareness of someone trained to assess threats. He has a Navy SEAL's bearing even lying in a hospital bed, his shoulders broad beneath the pale blue gown, his left leg wrapped in compression bandages where secondary shrapnel wounds are still healing. When Margaret approaches with the electronic thermometer, he watches her face with the intensity of someone searching for signs of competence. What he sees is a woman in her 50s, graying hair, tired eyes that have seen clinical dead before but refuse to look away from it. Vitals are stable, Captain, she says, her voice pitched low and level. You're in ICU because of the secondary lacerations and potential for cardiac complications from the blast trauma. We monitor continuously. Any chest pain, any shortness of breath, any dizziness, you signal immediately. Not to the call button. To me. Directly. She says this last sentence with the kind of authority that transcends rank, the authority of someone who has pronounced more people dead than he has years in his career. Rivera's eyes narrow slightly. You military. She says, which is not quite a lie but is also not the full truth. She pulls the challenge coin from her pocket and turns it over in her fingers once, twice, 3 times. The motion is unconscious, automatic, a nervous habit she has attempted to break for 2 decades without success. Rivera's eyes track the movement. His jaw tightens. Before he can speak, Caldwell enters the room with the digital tablet containing Rivera's full surgical imaging. Captain Rivera, Caldwell says, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone who has rehearsed this introduction multiple times. Dr. Marcus Caldwell, Chief of Surgery. I've personally reviewed your imaging, and I want to assure you that Cedar Creek has the highest standards of care. You're in excellent hands. Margaret finishes adjusting the cardiac monitor and steps back, her movements efficient and practiced. She does not introduce herself. She does not explain her background or qualifications. She simply exists in the corner of the room as the machinery that keeps the hospital functioning, visible but not seen, present but not acknowledged. Caldwell glances briefly at her, a dismissive flick of his eyes, as if confirming that the nursing staff is properly positioned and sufficiently quiet. The shrapnel missed your heart by 18 millimeters, Caldwell continues, pointing to the imaging on his tablet. Your surgeon at the military hospital did excellent work with the primary wound closure. What we're watching for is delayed pericardial effusion, fluid buildup around the heart. If that happens, we perform pericardiocentesis, a needle aspiration to remove the fluid. Standard procedure. Not something we anticipate, but it's why we keep you here under monitoring rather than releasing you to outpatient recovery. Rivera nods, his attention still partially fixed on Margaret, who is now standing by the monitors recording his vital signs into the electronic system. How long? He asks. 72 hours minimum, Caldwell says. If the imaging at the 48-hour mark shows no effusion, we can consider discharge. If there are any complications, we extend your stay. Simple protocol. Easy to follow. As long as everyone does exactly what they're supposed to do and doesn't try to improve on established procedures. He looks directly at Margaret when he says this, his gaze lingering for a moment too long, a clear message delivered in front of a patient who is too observant to miss it. Margaret continues recording data, her jaw set in the same neutral expression it has maintained for 3 years. Caldwell leaves the room at 6:19 a.m., speaking into his phone before the door even closes behind him. Surgical staff will round at 0700. I want standard pre-op protocols reviewed even though surgery is not planned. I want his surgeon aware that we're following Navy standard of care, not some improvised protocol that a floor nurse thinks will work better. Standards exist for a reason. At 6:34 a.m., Margaret is checking Rivera's chest dressing when she notices something on the monitor that makes her pause. The rhythm is still normal sinus, but there is a subtle variation in the QT interval, a lengthening that suggests early cardiac stress. It is subtle enough that the automated monitor has not flagged it. It is exactly the kind of thing that a standard protocol would miss and exactly the kind of thing that a nurse with 20 years of experience in trauma care would catch immediately. She pulls the previous imaging from the chart and compares it to the current reading. The difference is small. The significance is enormous. She pulls up the cardiac specialist's note in the system and reads the discharge recommendation from the military surgeon: monitor for any variation in QT interval greater than 480 milliseconds. If observed, initiate early EKG and notify attending physician immediately. This patient has history of electrolyte dysregulation in post-blast scenarios. Margaret pulls up Caldwell's protocol. It does not mention QT interval monitoring. It mentions standard vital signs, standard imaging at 48 hours, standard cardiac monitoring. It is a protocol designed for routine shrapnel injuries, not for a patient with documented electrolyte complications and the specific warning signs already flagged by his primary surgical team. She turns the challenge coin over in her fingers, once, twice, 3 times, and then she walks directly to the nursing station and pulls up Dr. Caldwell's direct line. At 6:41 a.m. she dials it. He picks up on the second ring, his voice already irritated before she speaks. This is Margaret Walsh from ICU. Captain Rivera's cardiac monitor is showing QT interval prolongation at 492 milliseconds. His primary surgical team documented electrolyte dysregulation as a risk factor. Standard protocol does not include specific QT monitoring. I'm recommending we pull a basic metabolic panel and repeat the EKG before waiting for the 48-hour imaging scheduled under current protocol. The silence on the other end of the line lasts for 4 seconds. When Caldwell speaks, his voice carries the kind of controlled anger that only comes from being questioned in front of someone else's authority structure. Captain Rivera's care follows Cedar Creek protocol. His military surgeon's recommendations are noted in his chart. My protocol supersedes those recommendations while he is a patient in my hospital. With respect, sir, Margaret says, her voice never wavering, never rising, never showing anything other than clinical precision. The protocol does not account for documented electrolyte dysregulation. The QT prolongation is measurable right now. We can draw labs in 7 minutes. It takes less than 2 minutes to interpret. If his electrolytes are destabilized, early intervention could prevent cardiac complications before they develop. Follow the protocol, Caldwell says, and the line goes dead. Margaret hangs up the phone and returns to Rivera's room. She does not mention the conversation. She does not explain that she has just recommended a deviation from protocol and been refused. She simply checks the monitors again, records the vitals, and makes a note in the system, attending aware of QT interval prolongation. Monitoring continues per protocol. The note is brief, clinical, and creates a record that cannot be erased. It is the kind of small action that means nothing in the moment and everything when the situation escalates, the kind of decision that separates adequate nursing from exceptional nursing, the kind of choice that a nurse who is just following protocol would never make. What happened next would change everything. Thursday morning arrived with the weight of a storm that hadn't yet broken. Margaret stood at the back of the teaching theater at Cedar Creek Medical, hands clasped in front of her scrubs, watching 80 medical students and residents fill the tiered seating like they were settling in for a performance. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, that constant mechanical drone that lived in hospitals the way silence lived in churches. Dr. Caldwell stood center stage with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no, holding up a patient chart. Her chart. Her name projected on the screen in letters large enough for the entire room to read. This, Caldwell said, his voice amplified through the teaching theater's sound system, is what happens when outdated triage practices meet modern medicine. He turned the chart toward the audience like a prosecutor presenting evidence. Nurse Walsh here decided a patient's self-reported pain level overrode my post-surgical protocol. She administered additional pain medication without consulting the attending physician. He paused. the silence was the kind that comes before punishment. In my ICU, we follow evidence-based hierarchies. Not gut feelings from the greatest generation. Laughter rippled through the tiered seats like water finding cracks. Margaret's jaw clenched. Her knuckles whitened where her fingers interlaced. But her face was a mask of absolute composure, the kind you develop when you've stared down things far worse than a surgeon's contempt. A medical student in the third row turned to look at her. She didn't blink. Didn't shift her weight. Didn't acknowledge that every eye in that room had briefly turned her way, sizing her up, dismissing her. One resident whispered something to his neighbor. Both of them smiled. Caldwell continued for another 8 minutes, dissecting her clinical judgment in front of an audience of people who would work the hospital corridors alongside her. His words hung in the recycled air like smoke, outdated, dangerous, reckless, beneath protocol. She had trained this hospital's residents before Caldwell arrived. She'd caught sepsis before the antibiotics. She'd known when to escalate and when to wait. But none of that mattered in a teaching theater. What mattered was that a man with a title and a phone line had decided to make her visible by making her small. Friday afternoon found her in the hospital's break room, moving through the corridors with a kind of efficiency that comes from knowing exactly which hallway bypasses the longest routes. 2 residents stood by the vending machine, Dr. Patel and Dr. Kim, their voices loud enough that hearing them required no effort at all. "Did you hear Caldwell call her Nurse Dinosaur in the attending lounge?" Patel said, feeding dollar bills into the machine slot. "Said she probably learned medicine from Civil War field manuals. Literally said she was a relic." Kim laughed, the kind of laugh that costs nothing and means everything about who's in and who's out. "She questioned his anticoagulation order yesterday. In front of the patient's family. I would have died." Margaret walked past them to refill her coffee, her limp barely noticeable anymore after 3 years of careful physical therapy, and they didn't bother lowering their voices. The coffee was lukewarm, tasting like the inside of a machine designed to extract labor instead of flavor. She stood there for exactly 17 seconds, letting them say what they needed to say, letting them establish their hierarchy and their loyalty to a man who understood that fear was currency. From his office window on the 3rd floor, Dr. Caldwell watched her walk past the vending machines. His phone was already in his hand. He nodded, a small gesture that the residents would see later, when they passed his office, and understand as approval. They had said the right things. They had chosen the right side. This was how hospitals worked beneath the surface, not through formal policy but through the quiet mathematics of power and allegiance. Saturday morning in the ICU, Captain James Rivera was recovering exactly as a post-operative cardiothoracic patient should recover. Margaret reviewed his chart at 6:33 a.m., her coffee still steaming in the stainless steel tumbler she'd carried for the past 3 years. His vitals were stable. His wound was clean. His breathing was steady. But his post-op care plan included a medication combination that made her hands still, an anticoagulation protocol paired with a vasodilator that, given the specific location of the shrapnel fragments embedded near his pericardium, could trigger cardiac tamponade. Fluid would accumulate around his heart like a noose tightening. The pressure would build. The chambers would collapse. She'd seen it before. Not at Cedar Creek. Years before Cedar Creek, in places where there were no teaching theaters and no hospitals with names and no surgeons with board seats warming in the afternoon sun. Dr. Caldwell was writing orders at the nurse's station, his hand writing the kind of aggressive script that comes from a man who has never questioned his own certainty. Margaret approached him quietly, the way you approach a sleeping animal you don't want to startle. "Doctor, I think we should consider adjusting his anticoagulation. The pericardial proximity to the shrapnel. You think?" He didn't look up from the chart. His voice was loud enough for the 3 nurses and 2 residents nearby to hear. The room went quiet in that specific way that announces a hierarchy is being reinforced. "Nurse Walsh, I performed cardiothoracic surgery while you were, what, emptying bedpans." Her hands remained at her sides, steady as surgical steel. She'd been called worse things by better men, in places where the consequences actually mattered. But there was something in the way he looked at her, not really seeing her at all, but seeing through her to whatever useful failure he could construct from her existence. His hand moved to the phone on the desk. "Security, I need an escort for a staff member in ICU. Now." Margaret said nothing. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then she spoke, her voice perfectly level, perfectly controlled. "Captain Rivera is going to have complications within 72 hours if that protocol stays active. Are you arguing with me?" His eyes had narrowed. His hand was still on the phone. "This is your final warning, Margaret. One more act of insubordination, one more time you undermine my authority in front of my staff, and you're finished. Do you understand me?" A security guard appeared at the end of the corridor, walking toward them with the neutral expression of someone whose job was simply to move bodies from one place to another. She nodded once, a small gesture that said nothing and everything, and turned to walk out. Her hand found the coin in her pocket as she moved, that tarnished piece of metal with the weight of 2 decades pressed into its edges. She could feel the shape of it through the fabric. She could feel the blood that had dried into its grooves more than 20 years ago, staining it the color of rust and memory. The ICU doors closed behind her. Sunday evening arrived quiet and medical, the kind of calm that hospitals maintain during their slow hours. Margaret moved through her rounds at 11:36 p.m., her badge catching the fluorescent light with each step. Captain Rivera was sleeping well, his chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of a body healing. She checked his vitals, heart rate steady at 68, blood pressure holding at 118/74, oxygen saturation 98% on room air. She adjusted his fur line and noticed something small on the back of his left hand, a thin scar that looked like it had been made by barbed wire a very long time ago. Something flickered in her memory. Just a flash. Just an image that didn't belong to Cedar Creek Medical or Portland or anything that came after the Navy told her she was dead. At 11:52 p.m., the automatic doors burst open with the violent sound of metal hitting its stops. Marcus Hoffman staggered in, disheveled, eyes wild, the kind of wild that comes from methamphetamine and rage and the certainty that someone had stolen something from him. His sister had been discharged 2 days ago, and whatever had happened after that discharge had convinced him that Cedar Creek Medical was responsible. He was waving a Glock 19 that looked enormous under the fluorescent lights, his finger resting against the trigger guard, sweat dripping from his jaw. "Where's the doctor?" He was screaming. "Where's the fucking doctor who told my sister she was fine?" She was fine? She was fine until she wasn't. A resident dropped to the floor behind the nurse's station. Dr. Patel froze with a clipboard in his hands, his mouth open. The unit secretary hit the ground and started crawling toward the corner. The ICU had exactly 4 patients. One of them was Captain James Rivera, sleeping 15 feet down the hallway. Margaret was standing at the nurse's station. She was standing between the gunman and the hallway where Captain Rivera's room waited like an open door. She took 3 steps forward. Her hands rose slowly, spreading wide in the space between them. The fluorescent light seemed to brighten as she moved, or maybe that was just the way time contracts when violence arrives, everything becomes sharper, louder, slower, and faster at the same time. Her voice dropped to a register none of them had heard in 3 years of shifts and coffee breaks and hospital hierarchies. It was a voice that had guided people through remedy. It was a voice that had spoken commands at sea. It was the voice of something ancient waking up beneath a floor nurse's name tag. "Look at me. Only me. Whatever happened, we can fix it, but I need you to look at me." Hoffman's hand was shaking. The gun waved in small circles, the barrel sweeping across the space where patients lay in beds, where monitors beat their steady mechanical prayers. His finger was on the trigger. Not the guard. The trigger. "What's your sister's name?" Margaret asked. Her voice was absolutely steady. "Tell me her name." The gun jerked. His finger tightened. and the first shot caught her in the right shoulder, spinning her sideways but not down, not stopping her from standing there in the hallway, still between him and the rooms where people slept, still blocking the path to Captain Rivera, still spreading her arms wider as if her body alone could become a wall. The hallway of Cedar Creek Medical's ICU was cathedral quiet at 11:22 p.m. on a Sunday, the kind of silence that only exists when most of the world is sleeping and the machines are the only things breathing. Margaret moved between rooms with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times, vitals check, medication verification, a gentle hand on Captain Rivera's forehead where his fever had finally broken. For patients in this wing tonight. For people whose lives depended on vigilance during the hours when most of the hospital staff was downstairs or home in bed. She had changed his dressing an hour ago, the shrapnel wounds from the training accident healing slower than textbook protocols predicted, but she'd seen worse. She'd seen men survive things that should have killed them. She'd seen men die when every number on every monitor said they should live. The door to the ICU burst open at 11:58 p.m. like a gunshot preceding a gunshot. A man in a threadbare hoodie, face hollow and jaw working with that particular intensity of someone riding methamphetamine for 16 hours straight, pushed through the security checkpoint with a .40 caliber Glock hanging from his right hand like it was part of his skeleton. His eyes were twin furnaces burning away everything that made him human. He was screaming about negligence, about his sister dying in this hospital 3 years ago, about doctors who didn't care and nurses who lied and a system that murdered people and called it medicine. His voice cracked across the ICU like a whip. The monitor alarm started first. Then the screaming from the night nurse, a young resident named Chen who dropped her tablet and pressed herself against the wall of the supply room. The other patients, the ones still conscious, began pressing their call buttons with trembling fingers. The grandfather on the ventilator couldn't press anything at all. Margaret was at the medication station when the man came through. She saw him before anyone else saw him. She saw the gun before she saw the face. And in the space between seeing and acting, which was approximately 1/10 of a second, she made a decision that would take her 48 hours to regret and a lifetime to understand. She stood up. She walked directly toward him. She did not run. She did not raise her hands in placation. She positioned herself in the hallway between him and Captain Rivera's room, 3 doors down, private suite, the man she'd been protecting since Wednesday morning, and she opened her mouth and spoke in the voice of someone who had talked down worse things than this man would ever become. "Hey," she said, and her voice was low and steady as a metronome. "Hey, I'm listening. Tell me about your sister." The man's name was Daniel Hoffman. 24 years old. Worked at a tire warehouse until 6 months ago when the methamphetamine found him or he found it, depending on which version was true. His sister's name was Sarah. She died on a Tuesday from complications of sepsis, post-operative, 3 years and 4 months ago. Her surgeon was not in this hospital anymore. Her nurses were transferred to other units. The administrator who signed off on her post-op protocols had retired. But the hospital remained, and in Hoffman's brain, rewired and burning from 60 days of sleeplessness and chemical rage, the hospital was still guilty. Margaret did not move. She kept her arms spread wide, palms open, shoulders squared to face him directly. The fluorescent lights above threw her shadow across the tile floor, a dark shape between Hoffman and the rooms behind her. "Sarah," Margaret said. "That's a good name. Tell me what she was like." Hoffman's hand came up. He was crying now, actually crying, which was the most dangerous thing he could have been doing because it meant something was breaking in him and breaking things behave unpredictably. His finger found the trigger guard. His arm moved with the jerky precision of someone barely in control of his own muscles. "She deserved better," he said. "She did," Margaret agreed. "And you deserve to keep her." His finger tightened on the trigger. The gun bucked in his hand like a living thing trying to escape. The report was impossibly loud in the enclosed space, not the way it sounds in movies, but sharper, more visceral, a sound that seemed to tear the air itself open. The bullet caught Margaret in the right shoulder, high, the impact spinning her sideways and backwards simultaneously, her left foot sliding on the white tile. For one moment she was off balance, vulnerable, the kind of moment that makes gunmen believe they've won. She planted her foot and straightened. She didn't look down at the blood blooming across her scrubbed shoulder. She didn't acknowledge the pain that was spreading like electricity down her right arm. She spread her arms wider. "You're right," she said. "You're right about all of it. And I see you. I see your pain." Hoffman made a sound that was almost a laugh. His gun hand was shaking. Behind him, Chen had managed to activate the silent alarm, the one that didn't sound in the unit but ran straight to security. ETA for minutes. For minutes was an eternity when someone had a gun. "You don't see anything," Hoffman said. "You're just a nurse. You don't matter." "No," Margaret agreed, and her voice dropped lower, the kind of voice a mother uses to talk a child down from a ledge. "I don't." "But you do." Sarah mattered. "You matter. And I'm going to listen." The second shot came as he was repositioning the gun, as something in his face shifted toward confusion. He'd expected anger, or fear, or the kind of self-protection that would have given him an enemy to point at. Instead he'd gotten acknowledgement. Instead he'd gotten witnessed. His hand jerked and the bullet caught Margaret low in the abdomen, left of center, and this time she couldn't stop the sharp intake of breath. She felt it like a punch from someone wearing a fist made of fire. Her leg buckled slightly, her knees bending and then straightening as muscle memory took over, the kind of memory that knew how to stand when standing was the only thing between alive and dead. Captain Rivera had woken up. She could hear him behind her, trying to get out of bed despite the 4 lines and the surgical tape and the left shoulder that still didn't fully work. The shrapnel had been close to his axillary nerve. Any movement risked more damage. "Stay down," she said, not turning her head. Her voice was different now, strained, but command grade. "Stay in that bed, Captain." "That's an order." Hoffman laughed again, but it was a fractured sound. His eyes were still burning, but something in them had started to recognize what he was doing. The gun was getting heavy in his hand. The recoil had bruised his wrist. He'd never shot at anything before. He'd never done anything except work at a tire warehouse and love his sister and then lose her and then lose himself in the chemical dark. "Why are you still standing?" he asked, and his voice had changed too. It sounded younger. It sounded confused. "Because you need me to," Margaret said. The third shot happened almost by accident. His hand jerked and her hand moved at the same moment and the gun barked again, and this time the bullet caught her right thigh, high up near the femoral artery, and she felt something fundamentally wrong shift inside her leg. The white tile floor beneath her suddenly looked very far away and also very close. Her leg didn't work anymore the way legs are supposed to work. It buckled, not from pain but from the physical fact of a bullet passing through muscle and nearly through artery, and she went down. She fell sideways, somehow still managing to twist her body so she remained between the rooms and the man with the gun, her right leg screaming, her shoulder on fire, her abdomen telling her very clearly that something important had been damaged in there. Her blood made a sound on the tile. It wasn't loud but it was very wet. It pooled around her hip like a dark mirror. "No," Hoffman said, and he dropped the gun like it had burned him. "No, no, no." The security guards came through the door at 12:03 a.m., 2 men built like they'd been assembled from steel and muscle, and Hoffman went down without resisting. He was crying so hard he couldn't stand up anyway. The gun clattered across the tile. One of the guards, a man named Mercer with the bearing of someone who'd worn a uniform once, called out a code, and the hospital came alive. Margaret was on her back on the white tile, looking up at the fluorescent lights, and she was thinking about Ramadi and how the light there had been different, more golden, more alive, and how she was very tired. Someone was screaming. Chen probably. Or maybe it was the grandfather on the ventilator finally succeeding at pressing his call button. Or maybe it was just the machines, all the machines at once, understanding that something had broken. A pair of running shoes appeared in her line of sight at 12:04 a.m. Expensive running shoes. Attached to a polo shirt tucked hastily into expensive khakis. Dr. Caldwell. She would have laughed if her body had permitted it. Of all the things she'd imagined for a moment like this, Dr. Caldwell was not on the list. But he was competent. That had never been in question. He took one look at the blood and the trajectory and the 3 separate wounds, and he did what he'd been trained to do. He called for trauma team. He identified the need for pericardiocentesis, though he didn't do it here, not with these tools. He called for the OR. He put pressure on the thigh wound while issuing a sequence of orders that sounded like poetry to people who understood medical language. O2 Sat 88. Get it higher. Type O negative. 2 units now, for more standing by. Core temperature? 36.1, we need to keep her warm. They moved her on a stretcher at 12:07 a.m., rolling fast, her blood already coming from the bags they'd hung above her head. She remembered thinking that the 4 lines felt cold going in, remembered the sensation of drugs being pushed that made the world slide sideways into something that wasn't quite sleep and wasn't quite consciousness. She remembered Captain Rivera's voice saying something she couldn't quite hear, and she remembered Caldwell's hands working on her in the OR with the same focus he brought to everything, like this was just another problem to solve, another inconvenience to fix. The surgery took 3 hours and 14 minutes. Caldwell removed 2 bullets, repaired the femoral artery with sutures that held, patched the hole in her intestine, worked on the shoulder wound that was going to need a specialist but wasn't going to cost her function. He was good. He was very good. She would have hated him for it if she'd had the energy to hate anything. By 4:51 a.m., she was in recovery, stable, her blood pressure holding at 104/67, her oxygen saturation at 97%. By 5:15 a.m., Caldwell was in the administrator's office on the 4th floor, wearing fresh scrubs now, looking like he'd already moved on to the next problem. We need to address the liability, he said, pulling out his phone. The administrator, a man named Foster with the look of someone who'd learned to never say anything he couldn't defend in a deposition, leaned back in his chair and listened. She violated every active shooter protocol we have. She engaged directly with an armed subject. She refused to take cover. She put herself in harm's way deliberately. That's on her, not on us. By 6 a.m., he'd called 2 board members, men who owed him favors from his surgical work, men who had sat across from him at hospital fundraisers and agreed that experience sometimes needed to be refreshed. By 8 a.m., he'd contacted Margaret's employment references, a clinic in Seattle, a nursing home in Spokane, places where no one seemed to remember much about her, places that gave him nothing useful but which he would use anyway. The morning sun came up over Portland and found Margaret in a hospital bed with 42 stitches and 3 bullet wounds and no idea that the machine was already in motion, that the same hands that had saved her life were now writing the narrative that would end it. Dr. Caldwell's hands moved with the precision of a surgeon who'd never doubted himself once in his life. Gloved fingers steady. Sutures placed at exact intervals. The entry wound in Margaret's shoulder closed with 11 stitches, each one a small testimony to his skill. The abdominal wound took 17. The thigh, another 14. 42 stitches total. He didn't speak during the procedure. Didn't need to. The room moved around him like he was conducting an orchestra, nurses anticipating his reach before he extended his hand, instruments appearing exactly when his fingers moved toward them. By 11:13 p.m. Tuesday, Margaret Walsh's vital signs had stabilized. Sinus rhythm. BP climbing back to 94/58. Oxygen saturation at 97% on a non-rebreather. She was alive because of his hands. By 8:03 a.m. Wednesday morning, those same hands had picked up a phone. The first call went to Richard Bancroft, hospital board chair, a man who'd never met Margaret but who understood the value of political positioning. Caldwell's voice was measured, almost regretful. We have a liability situation. Your floor nurse violated every active shooter protocol on the books. She positioned herself in the line of fire. Created exposure for the hospital. Bancroft listened. Caldwell continued. I've documented everything. Multiple protocol violations. Reckless endangerment. The board should be prepared for litigation. By 8:22 a.m., Caldwell had called 3 more board members. By 9:15 a.m., an outside risk management consultant was being scheduled. The consultant's name was Dr. Patricia Vance. She'd built a career helping hospitals avoid liability by removing liability, which meant removing people. The second wave of calls began at 10:51 a.m. Caldwell's administrative assistant, a woman named Helen who'd worked at Cedar Creek for 9 years and who knew exactly what tone of voice meant her boss was building a case, made the calls while he sat in his office, door closed, staring at Margaret's chart. A clinic in Seattle. A nursing home in Spokane. Long-term care facilities in Bend and Eugene. Places where the employment records were thin, where the references were vague, where no one seemed to remember much about a nurse named Margaret who'd worked there years ago. Helen left voicemails. Detailed inquiries about employment history. Performance issues. Any incidents of insubordination. The messages were polite but they carried weight. Caldwell had learned that weight was everything, the patient, steady pressure that built cases against people piece by piece. By noon Wednesday, Patricia Vance arrived at Cedar Creek's administrative offices carrying a leather briefcase and the clinical demeanor of someone who'd recommend the termination of her own mother if the spreadsheets demanded it. She spent 3 hours interviewing staff. Nurses who'd seen Margaret correct protocols. Residents who'd watched her question orders. A respiratory therapist who remembered her asking about ventilator settings during a routine check. Vance took notes in a small leather journal, each observation building the architecture of professional unfitness. By 4:17 p.m., she'd issued her preliminary recommendation. Margaret Walsh posed an ongoing liability risk and should be terminated immediately upon discharge. Margaret woke at 2:43 p.m. Thursday to the sound of the E4 pump soft beeping and the hum of the cardiac monitor, 2 sounds that had become the rhythm of her existence. For a moment she didn't remember. Then the pain arrived, shoulder first, a bright sharp burning that made her gasp. Abdomen next. Thigh last. The memories followed the pain like shadows. The gun. His face. The first bullet. The second. The third. She turned her head slowly. A man and a woman stood at the foot of her hospital bed. The man wore a grey suit and held a folder. The woman wore scrubs with an HR badge. Their faces carried the professional sympathy of people about to make your life significantly worse. "Ms. Walsh," the man said. His name was Stephen Reeves, hospital administrator. His voice was gentle, which made it worse. "How are you feeling?" She didn't answer. Her left hand lay across her abdomen, fingers splayed over the bandaging. Her right shoulder was immobilized. Her left thigh was wrapped so tightly the circulation felt compromised. She waited. "We've reviewed the incident," Reeves continued. "Your actions were undoubtedly heroic. The board recognizes that. Captain Rivera is alive because of your intervention." He paused, letting her think he was building toward something kind. "However, your decision to position yourself in the line of fire violated multiple hospital active shooter protocols. You created liability exposure that the hospital cannot sustain. Dr. Caldwell has documented the protocol violations and provided a detailed assessment of your judgment." Margaret's jaw tightened slightly. Her eyes remained fixed on the ceiling tiles. The woman from HR opened the folder. "Your employment is being terminated effective immediately. We've prepared your final paycheck, accrued vacation payout, and information about COBRA coverage." She slid a sheaf of papers across the bed. Dr. Caldwell made clear that continued employment would create ongoing risk for the institution. Just a nurse, Margaret thought. That's what they always called people like her. Just a nurse. Just following orders. Just a person who didn't understand the bigger picture of institutional liability and risk management and political positioning. She signed the termination paperwork with her left hand, her signature shaking slightly from pain. Reeves and the HR woman exchanged a glance that might have been relief. They'd come expecting resistance, tears, arguments. What they got was silence and compliance and a woman whose face showed nothing at all. They left her a plastic bag containing the remains of her work life. Scrubs cut open by the trauma team. Her shoes. A sweater. And the tarnished challenge coin, the one she'd carried in her pocket for 20 years without anyone knowing its weight or its cost. She held the coin in her left hand after they left, felt its edges bite into her palm. By 6:15 p.m. Thursday, Margaret had pulled on the sweater over her immobilized shoulder with an amount of patience that would have impressed surgeons. She'd signed herself out against medical advice, the discharge nurse warning her about infection risk and pain management and follow-up care. She couldn't stay. Couldn't go back to her apartment. The landlord had already texted, his message brief and clear, given the media coverage, "We need to discuss your lease." Couldn't call anyone. Couldn't explain anything. She moved through the parking garage like a ghost, each step careful, her thigh screaming with every weight-bearing movement. The rain started as she reached the street, light at first, then harder, cold water running down her face mixing with sweat. She found an all-night diner on Powell Boulevard at 2:24 a.m., the neon sign buzzing against the dark. The waitress didn't look twice at her, another person coming in from the rain, sitting in a corner booth, ordering coffee she wouldn't drink. At 3:04 a.m., Margaret sat alone with the cup growing cold in front of her. The diner was empty except for the waitress and a man reading a newspaper near the window. The fluorescent lights hummed their industrial song. The coffee shop smelled like burnt beans and yesterday's grease. She stared at her reflection in the dark window, hollow eyes, grey skin, a woman who looked like she'd been carved out of bone and regret. This is what Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh was thinking as the rain hammered the diner's windows. Ramadi, 2004. A building collapsing. A child screaming. An old man pressing a coin into her hand, blood on his fingers, his voice steady even as he bled out. Keep him safe. Promise me. She'd promised. She'd carried that boy through 16 hours of sniper fire, his father's weight against her chest, his heartbeat slowing and then stopping. She delivered him alive. Kandahar, 2009. A helicopter pilot with a severed brachial artery, the kind of wound that meant death in 6 minutes if you didn't know the anatomy. She'd known it. Her hands had known it. She'd closed the artery with direct pressure, held it closed for 40 minutes while they waited for an extraction bird. The pilot lived. Kept his arm. Last she heard, he was teaching at the Naval Academy. Yemen, 2008. An operation that was never supposed to happen. An extraction that went sideways. A congressman's nephew died in the dust, his name classified, his death classified, the entire operation classified so thoroughly that the official government record said it never occurred. The Navy had called her into a room and told her exactly what she was hearing now. You are dead, Master Chief. Your records are gone. Your service is gone. We'll provide a new identity, new credentials, new everything. But you can never surface. Never use your rank. Never tell anyone what you've done. You died in Yemen. This is your second life. She'd done everything right for 15 years. Changed her name. Worked under false certifications that a handler updated every 2 years. Kept her head down. Stayed invisible. Saved lives quietly, the way the military had taught her to do impossible things without acknowledgement. And it still wasn't safe. The world found her anyway. The truth had gravity. Margaret touched the challenge coin on the table, traced her fingers over its edges. Captain James Rivera's father, Miguel Rivera, contractor, logistics coordinator, a man who'd volunteered to work in a war zone to support his family, had pressed this coin into her palm while bleeding out. The coin was tarnished now, discolored, marked by 2 decades of carrying the weight of a promise made to a dying man in a war zone. She'd kept that promise. She'd kept it when it meant nothing, when no one was watching, when keeping a promise to a dead man was just muscle memory and honor code and the kind of loyalty that the modern world had no use for. And she'd kept it again 48 hours ago, taking 3 bullets to keep a promise to a boy she'd saved in a desert 20 years earlier. This is what exhaustion felt like. Not the kind that sleep fixed. The kind that came from surviving things you weren't supposed to survive, from being erased by your government, from building a new life that was never quite real, from watching that new life collapse in 48 hours because you'd done the only thing you'd ever known how to do, move toward the person who needed saving. The coin lay on the table between her and the untouched coffee. Outside, Powell Boulevard was empty except for the rain and the occasional car, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Margaret Walsh sat in the humming fluorescent light and wondered if there was a point to surviving a war zone just to disappear in a hospital. She had no idea what was about to happen. Thursday morning came grey and cold. Margaret pushed through the front doors of Cedar Creek Medical at 7:17 a.m., her left shoulder wrapped tight beneath a borrowed jacket, her thigh still wrapped where the third bullet had tunneled through muscle and membrane. 42 stitches held her together. Her discharge papers sat in her pocket, dated 36 hours prior, signed against medical advice by a woman who couldn't afford to stay. The lobby smelled like antiseptic and broken promises. She moved toward the employee entrance, past the front desk where nobody made eye contact. 3 days ago these same people had watched her collapse. Now they looked away. That was fine. Margaret had spent 20 years learning to be invisible. The erasure was something she understood. She took the elevator to the 4th floor. Staff locker room C, 53 steps from the nurse station. Her combination was still 21, 43, 17, not because she was sentimental but because numbers like that you never forget. The lock clicked open and she began pulling her scrubs down from the shelf. 3 uniforms, all pressed. A photograph of Captain Rivera and his father, taken in Ramadi in 2004, the colors faded to sepia. Her name tag that read Margaret Walsh RN, 3 years of Cedar Creek, no asterisk, no footnote. And the coin. Tarnished silver, heavy in her palm. One side bore the insignia of the Navy SEALs. The other side was darker, marked with something that looked like rust but wasn't rust. Captain Rivera's father had pressed that coin into her hand as she carried him out of the collapsed building, his blood already spreading across his dress uniform, his voice already thin. "Keep my son safe," he'd said. "Take this. Keep him safe." She had. For 20 years she had kept that promise. The coin had stayed in her pocket through Yemen and through 15 years of being dead on paper, and it had stayed there while she pushed pills and held full lines in a place nobody knew who she was. She reached for her locker door to close it. That's when every monitor in the hospital changed at once. The television mounted above the staff break room flickered. Then every screen, in the lobby, in the waiting room, on the nurse stations, cut to black. When the image came back, it was CNN. Breaking news banner in red. A photograph filled the screen, and Margaret's breath stopped coming. It was her. 20 years younger, hair pulled back exactly like it was now, standing in front of a Black Hawk helicopter with her hands on the shoulders of a 7-year-old boy who looked terrified and safe at the same time. The photo dissolved to a second one, her and 4 other operators in front of a compound somewhere in Kandahar. Then a third, classified marking still visible at the bottom, a young woman with lieutenant commander insignia, serious eyes, scar tissue visible on her left jawline. A Pentagon spokesperson appeared on screen. Military uniform, 2 stars on each shoulder. His voice came through the speaker system of the entire hospital. After a viral video analysis conducted by a veteran recognition network, we have located Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, who was officially declared deceased following a classified extraction operation in Yemen in 2009. Master Chief Walsh has been serving as a civilian healthcare worker in Portland, Oregon, with no active connection to military service. Her location has now been confirmed, and she will be formally reinstated to active duty status effective immediately. Margaret couldn't move. The coin was in her hand. The photograph on the screen showed her hands, hands that had saved 43 lives under fire, hands that had held Captain Rivera's father as he died in the rubble of a building that shouldn't have been hit, hands that had taken 3 bullets to keep a Navy captain safe 48 hours ago. The break room door swung open. Dr. Patel and 2 nurses stopped in their tracks, staring at the screen, then staring at Margaret. The silence lasted 2 seconds. 3. Then the lobby doors opened downstairs and Margaret heard it, boots on marble tile, the distinctive sound of dress uniforms, the kind of synchronized military movement that meant someone official had just entered the building. She stood. Her thigh pulled with pain, the gait would be uneven, would read wrong. She moved toward the stairwell anyway. Muscle memory took over. The lobby was already crowded. News crews. Security officers. And there, in the center of the floor, in dress whites that were impossibly crisp and white against the gray of Portland winter, Captain James Rivera stood at perfect attention. He looked at Margaret as she descended the final stairs, and something in his young military face shifted. His eyes were the same color they'd been in Ramadi when she'd carried him through the streets as his father bled out beside her. He lifted his chin slightly. A recognition. An acknowledgement. He spoke 4 words. Reaper 6. The radio call sign hit Margaret like shrapnel. Nobody outside the teams knew that name. Nobody had called her that in 15 years. The sound of it broke something open in her chest, and for a moment, just one moment, her composure cracked. Her jaw clenched so tight her teeth hurt. The hospital security guard, the former Marine who'd worked Cedar Creek for 4 years and had never said a word about recognizing something in the way Margaret moved, suddenly straightened to his full height. His hand came to his chest in a salute. His voice carried through the lobby, through the news cameras, through the phones that were already recording. Master Chief Petty Officer on deck. The front doors of Cedar Creek Medical opened again. This time a 2-star Admiral walked through, his uniform pressed so sharp it could cut glass, flanked by 4 officers in dress whites. The Admiral moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had spent 40 years commanding men and women into impossible situations. He didn't hurry. He didn't need to. The room itself seemed to move around him, making space. He walked directly to Margaret. She straightened. Her hand came to her side, perfect posture despite the wound in her thigh, despite the bullet hole still seeping through the gauze under her borrowed jacket. The Admiral unfolded a document, creased, official, military seal visible at the top. His voice was low enough that it only reached the people standing closest. Then he raised it, and his words carried through the entire lobby like a command. Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. 3 Navy Crosses. He paused. The room was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. 2 Purple Hearts. He let that sink into the marble. 17 combat deployments. Another pause. Each medal, each deployment, each moment hung in the air like a separate thing. 43 lives saved under direct fire. Combat medicine. Hostage rescue. 3 operations classified beyond top secret level. Your status as deceased is hereby reversed. Your service record is unsealed and restored. The United States Navy welcomes you home, Master Chief. Captain Rivera stepped forward. His voice broke like a young man's voice breaks when he's holding something he thought he'd lost forever. In Ramadi, you carried my father and me for 16 hours. There were snipers in every building. You didn't sleep. You didn't put us down. You kept saying you had a promise to keep. He reached into his pocket with shaking fingers. The crowd leaned in. He pulled out a challenge coin, new, bright, Navy captain insignia gleaming, and placed it in Margaret's hand next to the tarnished one. My father died thinking you were dead. I spent 20 years wondering what happened to the woman who saved me. I want you to have this. I want you to know I kept the promise too. I lived. I served. I became what you taught me to be. The room fell into 10 seconds of absolute silence. Then the Admiral turned. His eyes found Dr. Caldwell, who stood at the edge of the growing crowd, his face already pale, his hand reaching for his phone as if muscle memory might still save him. You must be Chief of Surgery Caldwell, the Admiral said. His voice could have frozen the ocean. The man who terminated a decorated war hero for political advancement. Caldwell's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The Admiral continued, turning slightly to address the cameras, the crowd, the entire hospital watching on the screens that had erupted with live feeds. An emergency board meeting was convened 1 hour ago. Dr. Caldwell, your hospital credentials are hereby revoked, effective immediately. The hospital board has voted unanimously for your termination. You violated the trust placed in you. You attacked a hero because she questioned your protocols. Master Chief Walsh didn't violate active shooter procedure. She did what she's always done. She put herself between danger and those who couldn't protect themselves. 2 security officers appeared at Caldwell's elbows. Not asking. Not gentle. He was being walked out through the side entrance, already reaching for lawyers who wouldn't answer the phone fast enough, already understanding that his career had just evaporated like morning mist. The Admiral pinned a medal on Margaret's blood-stained jacket, still wearing the clothes from the all-night diner, still bearing the evidence of the shooting and the surgery and the erasure. Reporters surged forward, questions overlapping, cameras flashing. The lobby erupted in applause that sounded like rain on a metal roof, that sounded like every person she'd ever saved suddenly finding their voice at once. Dr. Patel was crying. Dr. Kim had her hands over her mouth. The residents who had laughed at the vending machine 3 days ago were staring at the floor like it might open and swallow them. The hospital administrator was already on his phone, already doing damage control, already trying to rewrite the story before it got any worse. Margaret stood with both coins in her hand, the tarnished one and the new one, her jaw still tight, her eyes still forward, but something had shifted in her face. The mask was coming off. The voice was changing. The woman who had been invisible was finally allowed to be seen. Captain Rivera's arm found her shoulders. His hand, steady, military, grateful, rested there like a benediction. The Admiral gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. The cameras kept recording. The story that Cedar Creek Medical had tried to bury was already spreading through every newsroom in America. Margaret Walsh existed again. If you're still watching, hit that like button. And I want to know, would you have saved the man who fired you, or walked away? Drop your answer in the comments. Subscribe and let's see how this ends.